The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome. Welcome to the Yaron Brook Show on this Monday night. Everybody had a great weekend and a great beginning of your week. All right. We've got a bunch of stuff to talk about today. Middle East and systemic racism. Those are going to be the two topics we're going to talk about today. Of course, you can use the super chat to ask questions about those topics or about anything else. You get priority if you attach $20 to those to the question on the super chat, and you get priority in terms of answering the question. I'm glad many of you seem to have enjoyed the couple of interviews I did. Was it Friday and Sunday? One with Matt Bateman on education, and the other one on Adam Ossoff on patents and IP. If you did enjoy them and you found them of value, and then share them. Get them out there, share them, get other people exposed to these ideas, get other people exposed to the Yaron Brook Show and to the interviews and to the people I had on the interviews. And that's how we get the ideas out there. We get the ideas out there by people sharing, and it's slowly spreading and it's slowly growing. So please share the ideas. All right, so let's jump into it. Let's start with the situation in Israel, or kind of what's going on there. And I'm not going to get into too much of the details here because I don't think the details matter that much. But over the last few weeks, there have been significant demonstrations in East Jerusalem, particularly around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Muslim holy site, which sits right on the Wailing Wall, which is the Jewish holy site, which is a site of contention between religious Jews and religious Muslims in terms of their holiness to each group. Today, I think, was a commemoration. Today or yesterday, maybe yesterday, was a commemoration of some would say liberation of Jerusalem. Others would say the conquest of Jerusalem by the Israelis during the 1967 war. Before 1967, Jerusalem was split into two. There was East Jerusalem that was occupied by the Jordanians, and that included the holy sites, that included the old city and the walls of the city, and then the new city, the city outside of the walls, what's called West Jerusalem, was part of Israel, and the city was split into two. I was born in Jerusalem during this period, a period in which Jerusalem was a split city, half Jordanian, half Israeli, and where sometimes you get snipers on the walls of the old city, on the Arab side, shooting at people on the Israeli side. So a city divided. That's the history of it pre-1967. So you start to get demonstrations. It's hard to tell exactly what started it. Certain requirements that the Israeli have not to congregate. I think they put a limit of not more than 10,000 people praying at once at the mosque, and the Palestinians took offense to this, and they started these daily kind of battles between Palestinians and Israeli police. Now, this is what's interesting about East Jerusalem. Separate and different from the West Bank, from the rest of the territory that is considered, where the Palestinians are. Jerusalem has actually been annexed by Israel. So technically, East Jerusalem is part of Israel. So any demonstrations that happen or any problems that happen in East Jerusalem are a police affair. They're not a military affair. And indeed, East Jerusalem, Arab Muslim residents of East Jerusalem vote in the Israeli election. They are full-on Israeli citizens, which is not the case with the rest of the Palestinians. There are, and you could think about it in a sense, in Israel, there are three categories of Arab residents. They're the Arabs who lived in Israel before 1967, and they're full Israeli citizens with all the rights the Israeli have. You could argue that there is discrimination against them, but it's not systemic, and for the most part, it doesn't exist. Then there are the residents of East Jerusalem, which became Israeli citizens when Jerusalem was annexed to Israel, and I do not remember the date of that, but it was annexed to Israel at some point, and they are now Israeli citizens, full-fledged Israeli citizens, with supposedly all the rights Israeli citizens have. And then there are the residents of the West Bank, and the residents of the West Bank do not have Israeli citizenship. They technically vote in Palestinian elections that haven't been held in over a decade and were supposed to be held recently and got postponed again and keep getting postponed. And they're not Israeli citizens, but they're not citizens of any other country. They're basically being occupied by Israel. But they have some sense of autonomy where the Palestinian Authority rules over them, an authority, again, there's been no election, so it's an authoritarian authority over them. But it's limited by the fact that Israel has military control over the area. So those are kind of the three categories. Anyway, so there were demonstrations, I think, over the weekend. They grew dramatically to the point where about 300 Palestinians got injured in demonstrations a couple of nights ago. I think a dozen or 2 dozen Israeli police men were also injured. Nobody's died yet, even though grenades have been thrown and a lot of mayhem has been caused, but no deaths yet. So kind of that's what's going on in the West Bank. It's Ramadan. So Muslims during this period don't eat during the day. A lot of times during Ramadan, kind of tempers flare. It's both religion fervor and maybe hunger. Emotions. People get particularly excited and angry, and this is a period in which there's a lot of mayhem. And you're seeing the press report about this. The press primarily is taking it depends on the press you listen to, but primarily a pro-Palestinian perspective, the oppressive Israelis. But they forget that the oppressive Israelis, these are Israeli citizens. These are Israeli citizens, again, that have technically all the rights that a Jewish Israeli citizen would have. Now, this is spreading now to the rest of the West Bank, so there are some demonstrations outside of Jerusalem. Those are handled by the military because those are military issues. And then I think it was earlier today or yesterday with the time zones. I'm not sure which day is which, but the Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is a little strip of land. You can look at a map right by the Mediterranean. It's tiny, and in which that is ruled by Hamas. Hamas is an Islamist terrorist organization that basically won the election and rules over Gaza. Of course, they only have one election. They've never had an election since. The Hamas dominates that area and violates the individual rights of its own citizens dramatically. It's an authoritarian religious regime. Hamas started launching missiles towards Israel. 6 of them towards Jerusalem, the rest towards other different villages and towns close to the border with Gaza. In addition, what the Palestinians in Gaza do is they fill these balloons and they light a basket under the balloon and they let this thing go, and it floats into Israeli territory and drops and starts fires. So you get dozens of fires being started by these Palestinians trying to burn down the fields of the Israelis. So this is the situation on the ground. It's not surprising, because what we have today is a indefensible status quo. A status quo in which the Israelis are dominant, but they haven't won. They haven't defeated the Palestinians. The Palestinians are committed by charter, by verbiage, by education, by their action, to destroying Israel. But they don't have the power to destroy Israel, so all they can do is heckle and poke and kill people and use terrorism and burn down fields and create mayhem and havoc and destruction. And Israel will try to straighten things out once in a while and go in there and straighten things out and then establish a status quo where nobody's happy. And something will happen to provoke one side or to provoke the other side. And there'll be another rise in violence, and then that'll be subdued, but not subdued enough to actually defeat one side to having actually defeated the other side, but subdued enough to buy you a little bit more time so that the next time there's another occurrence of violence, and so on, and so it goes. And the fact is that because, in my view, of the moral weakness of Israel and the moral weakness of the United States, but primarily Israel, because Israel is the player on the ground, Israel refuses to win a war that is very winnable for them. It has basically accepted a status quo that is inevitable to lead to more violence, to more conflict, to more struggle, to more back and forth. It continues to have peace negotiations with Palestinians on and off over the years. The Trump administration famously, had a two-state solution, peace deal that it offered the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Palestinians rejected it out of hand. The Israelis kind of accepted it. But that peace deal, for example, would have assigned Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, as the capital of the Palestinian state. So even though these Palestinians are Israeli citizens, they believe, they have hope, they have reason to hope that if they're violent enough, if they poke Israel enough, if they bother Israel enough, and if they use their position as so-called victims enough, then altruism will kick in, and the international community in the United States will put pressure on Israel to give them a state, including a capital in Jerusalem, which will just then be step one towards what they ultimately want, which is to eliminate, take over Israel completely and eliminate the Jewish population in Israel. So, Palestinians have reason to think that they can win. The Israelis refuse to win outright. And Palestinians, as long as they believe that they can win, will continue on the path that they're on, will continue being aggressive, will continue trying to create conflict, will continue to harass the Israelis enough so that the Israelis will respond with violence. The United States and the international community will put pressure on Israel. Israel will ultimately, they hope, capitulate, and they'll sign some kind of ridiculous peace agreement with them, which they don't have any intent to fulfill, but which will give them a political base and a military base and a missile base, then to continue to harass the Israelis until they can completely eliminate the state of Israel. Now, I know many of you probably have a lot of questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can do that through the Super Chat. Many of you, particularly the libertarians among you, might think that I'm completely wrong about this, and the Palestinians here are the victims, and the Israelis are evil occupiers, thieves, which I don't understand, because anarchists should think that, Israel just had a better competitive army, a better competitive system, so it beat the Palestinians. Might makes right, after all. But I'm sure many of you have questions about this. You can ask those questions in the super chat. I don't just answer questions in the chat. So if you want to ask the question, you just have to put a few dollars onto it, anywhere from $2 to $500, $1,000 actually, I think we can do in this system. And I would be happy to answer any questions that you would like. So feel free to use the super chat to ask questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, anything you want about the conflict, going back as far back as you want. $20 questions, of course, get priority. Yes, you should like the show. If you like it, you should subscribe to the show if you're not already a subscriber. And you should use the super chat to support the show. And you can also support the show on a monthly basis, like 560 of you already do, by going to YaronBrookShow.com/support, or by Patreon or Subscribestar or Locals. And there you can support the show with a monthly contribution. As I said, about 560 of you do that already. So please do that. If you ask super chat questions, I will answer specifically to what interests you rather than me just talking about what interests me. So obviously a lot of the criticism of Israel here is based on the idea that Israel is an occupying country. It is occupying the West Bank. Now this is absurd. I mean, there's an element of truth. Yes, it's occupying it. But the fact is that Israel occupies the West Bank because it took the West Bank in an act of self-defense. It was attacked. In 1967, Jordan was asked by the Israelis explicitly not to enter the war. The war was primarily on the southern front in Egypt and on the northern front on the Golan Heights with Syria. The Jordanian king was asked not to intervene, and he chose to step in. He chose to launch a war against Israel. Read it. And Israel, in an act of self-defense, took the land. In its peace deal with Jordan, Jordan didn't want the West Bank. So Israel occupied the land in a war of self-defense against Jordan. And then Jordan refused to take it back, was not interested in it. And Israel was stuck with it. The Palestinians living there have refused time and time and time and time again to actually sign a peace agreement. A Palestinian state has been offered to them on a number of different occasions, and they refused in every one of them. They've engaged in terrorism to try to get everything that they demand, which is basically total control of that land, a right of return for Palestinians to homes in Israel that they vacated and sometimes were driven out of during a war, again, self-defense, which Israel refuses legitimately. And they reject peace deal after peace deal after peace deal. So the idea that Israel is an occupier is true. But what choice does it have exactly? Let people who actually want to destroy it just have the land unconditionally? Well, Israel did that. We've got an experiment. We've got a perfect experiment of exactly that. And that experiment is the Gaza Strip. Israel basically vacated the Gaza Strip in the early 2000s, dismantled any settlements that existed in the Gaza Strip that were run by Israelis, and handed the Gaza Strip over to the Palestinians. And what is the consequences? The consequences are that Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. A terrorist nation was born in the Gaza Strip that launches missiles, rockets, fires into Israel on a regular basis. The Gaza Strip is not occupied by Israel. And yet Israel continues to be attacked. Tunnels are built. Terrorist attacks are launched from there. Missiles are launched. So Palestinians were granted a piece of land, told that they had full autonomy on it, no occupation. They could do whatever they want, except violate the rights of Israelis by launching attacks on Israel. And yet, what do? They violate the rights of their own citizens. They instill basically a theocratic, authoritarian state, and then they launch constant, regular attacks on Israel. So Israel should do the same thing on the West Bank, so they can now be attacked from two sides? Of course not. That would be suicide. It would be insane. Right? Now, it's fascinating that, and this is the power of altruism, in spite of the fact that Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of Israel, in spite of the fact that Hamas launches terrorist attacks on Israel regularly, in spite of the fact that they launch missiles, in spite of the fact that the Gaza Strip is is at war with Israel, Israel supplies the Gaza Strip with electricity. It supplies the Gaza Strip with water. All the electricity and water comes from lines that come from Israel. It basically is keeping alive, keeping running, keeping existing the people who literally want to kill them. Talk about altruism and self-sacrifice. Gaza Strip doesn't get its electricity from Egypt, doesn't get its water from Egypt, which it has a border with in the southwest. It gets it from... Yeah, Jeff, I saw the question. I got it. I will answer it, I promise. It'll be first, because it's a $20 question. So here you have a little state that Israel, again, does not defeat, does not crush, but allows them to launch missiles, to launch bombs, to launch fires, to just constantly harass and sometimes kill American citizens at a very low cost to Israel itself. That's altruism in foreign policy in action. And by the way, whenever it gets tough with the Gazans, America and the rest of the world start complaining about Israel, trying to cut them off, and they stop. The International Court of whatever in The Hague has tried to convict Israeli generals, Israeli politicians of crime against humanity or whatever, for what they do in the Gaza Strip. Why? When it's an act of self-defense, nobody will say. All right, quick questions. Let's see, $20 question. We've got two of them now. Is Dershowitz's case for Israel two-state or Carolyn Glick's one-state solution the answer? I think in the end, the solution has to be a one-state solution. A two-state solution, I guess, is possible, but the Arab state would be so small. The Arab state will be so dependent on the larger Israeli state that it would be insignificant. And if the Arabs were truly peaceful, if they were truly willing to establish a state side by side with Israel, I would argue the one-state solution, therefore, is better. Now, Caroline Glick has all kinds of ideas on how to incentivize the Arabs to leave, which I'm not in favor of. I don't think the government should be concerned with the, ethnic, religious composition of the state, of the people in the state. But I think given the size of the place, I mean, Israel's tiny. It's if you had highways, right, from the northern tip to the southern tip is maybe a 6-hour drive. It's a 40 to 50-minute drive width. That's it. And you want 2 states within a 40-minute drive. It's just, I don't think it's feasible, and I don't think it's sustainable. So I think a one-state solution is the right approach, but the only way to do that is for Palestinians to completely and utterly change the culture that they have. They would have to embrace a culture of modernity, of, even a little bit of Western civilization. They'd have to embrace individualism, freedom, recognize rights of individuals. So they would have to go through a significant cultural transformation. Now, granted, there's some within the Palestinian Authority that have that already, that are already believers in that, but they are the tiniest of minorities. Now, it is also true that Israel is not a saint here by far, particularly the more religious elements in Israel, the nationalist elements in Israel, those who want Israel to be Jewish and dominantly Jewish and religion to guide everything within the state, those elements would have to be subdued. And you would have to establish a separation of church and state in Israel. You would have to establish a constitutional government in Israel. Israel does not have a constitution today, which protected the rights of individuals, whether Jews or Muslims or anything else, or Christian, or Jews, or any other religion. And you would then be able to establish a one-state solution, but that is not going to happen until Israel thoroughly, unequivocally defeats the Palestinians. It is only thorough and devastating defeat which has any chance of causing Palestinian culture to rethink all its beliefs and to embrace an alternative, to embrace Western civilization. It's what happened to Japan, and what happened to some extent to Germany. You've got to bring the defeated culture to its knees so that it questions everything it believes in, so that it challenges everything and is willing to embrace something new, something radical, something different for them. And here, it is the Palestinians who should embrace the system that is Israel. Israel is a relatively, as Western countries go, free country. Therefore, a relatively wealthy country, relatively successful country. So, to me, it's Israel's weakness, unwillingness, and maybe political inability to actually defeat the Palestinians, which is preventing peace, which is preventing a solution. And by preventing peace and preventing a solution, they are both bringing about death and destruction of Israelis and of Palestinians, long term. You have to win. And you have to make it clear to the other side that they have no hope. Every time you give them hope, you encourage terrorism. You encourage violence. You encourage them to seek victory. The only way for them to stop seeking victory is to make it clear through defeat, that they will not ever be victorious. The Japanese at the end of World War II understood that that was it. Their dream was over. It was finished. And indeed, the whole ideology, the whole philosophy that got them there was hopeless and useless and needed to be trashed. And that's why Japan is what it is today. So, it's going to take real moral courage someday by someone to actually go through what's engaged. And I don't think Israeli culture is capable of it, because it's soft, it's very dominated by the same altruism that is all over the West. It's embraced victimhood, victim culture. It's a little better because there is an understanding. There is an understanding in Israel that you got to be tough with the Palestinians, otherwise they destroy you. So there is no, I like to say, there's almost no left wing in Israel when it comes to Palestinians. The left is tiny. Basically, the center left and the center right are all in the center. They all want the status quo. They all just want to pretend that this will go away. They all want to bury their head in the sand and pretend that somehow a peace deal will happen. Somehow things will get better. Somehow the Palestinians will wake up. Or maybe they won't, but everything will just be hunky-dory and stay the same as it is today. So both Israeli left and right engage in massive amounts of evasion in order to not to deal with the problem. But there really isn't a left. There isn't a defeatist left. There isn't a surrender left. There isn't a left that says, let's give the Palestinians everything they want. That left is very weak in Israel. Very, very weak. Just like in Israel, there's no real economic left. The true economic left, the socialist left, is very small. It's very politically weak. All right, let's see. Let's see, what question should I do first? Is there any solution possible when the entire surrounding region celebrates barbarism? Is the solution with the greatest possibility of success just the dissolution of Israel? No, I don't think so. I think the solution is the victory of Israel. I think when Israel is tough, when Israel is unequivocally a victor, when Israel is unyielding and is willing to exert its military superiority and its military might in order to bring peace, then I think the neighbors in the surrounding areas will admire it and respect it. They'll want to emulate it. And they might, as a consequence, consider adopting Western values. So what they need is, again, to be defeated. To be defeated. Now, I've spoken a lot about this phenomena of defeat and the whole Arab world and its attempt to westernize and the failure of that attempt and the rise of radical Islam. I've got two courses that are available for free on YouTube. One on the history, a short history of the Middle East, which I highly recommend. I think anybody who's listened to it has really, really learned a lot and enjoyed it. It's really a history of the Middle East from the rise of Islam till today. And then another one, which is on the rise of radical Islam. So the rise of radical Islam, and that's also available on YouTube for free. So you can listen to those, and there I kind of give you the whole breadth of everything I think about the Middle East, its culture, why the culture is the way it is, why it didn't westernize when it had an opportunity to westernize. But a lot of it has to do. History of the Middle East. It's called A Short History of the Middle East, and it's on YouTube. And just do Yaron Brook Middle East, and you'll find it. It's like 4 parts, 5 parts, something like that. I don't think you'll find a better kind of short history anywhere online. And the same with the history of the rise of Islamism or Islamic totalitarianism. I think I use the term Islamic totalitarianism in that course. But you can find that as well. It's, I think, 3 and 4 parts. And you'll just get a real sense of what the Middle East is, how it got to where it is, what were the forces shaping it, what were the pro-West, the anti-West, what were the fascist forces shaping it, what were the Islamist forces shaping it. So those 2 courses, you get an entire overview. I've also done a bunch of talks on Israel itself. You can find those as well, including a critique of Zionism. Now, I don't know if my critique of Zionism ever made it to YouTube. I'll check on that and I'll let you know. But yes, I've done lectures and courses and stuff like that, and it's all, you can find it online. Although my rise and decline of the State of Israel, which is where I talk about Zionism, I'm not sure if that's there. Of course, if you want to know more about Zionism, you can ask me in the Super Chat. Yeah, it's a 5-part series on the short history of the Middle East. Really, really worthwhile watching. I encourage everybody to do so. If you want to understand the region, if you want to understand the world in which you live, and want to understand why that region is such a complete and utter disaster. All right, can you briefly just give a history of who controlled and who lived within this area? It seems that many argue over this. I wish there was a history of this conflict I could trust to be unbiased. Do you recommend one? Again, I would recommend the stuff I've done on this conflict and the Ilan Journal. If you look on the ARI website, maybe on the Ayn Rand Institute e-store, you will find stuff that Ilan Journal has done in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'll give you the outline of the history. Basically, if you go back to the 19th century, the population of that part of the world was very small. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean was very small. Cities like Tel Aviv did not exist. There was a city of Jaffa, but it was it was a small one. And the population was small. A lot of the land, not most of the land, a lot of the land was swamps. Of course, half of the land in Israel is desert. And there was almost nothing there. During the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, while this land was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, Jews started emigrating to this land. They bought land from Arab landlords who often lived in Syria or in Jordan or in Lebanon. And they bought the land and they started cultivating. They also they dried swamps. They took over land that was unowned by anybody. And they slowly started building industry, building agriculture communities. They started the city of Tel Aviv on the sands of the beach in just north of the town of Jaffa, and they built a country. They slowly started building a civilization. During World War I, there was a lot of effort. The British obviously took control of the region. They beat the Ottomans. They militarily defeated the Ottoman Empire and landed up at the end of it with the whole region, right? The French had the northern part of the region, that is Syria and Lebanon. And basically the British had all of the Saudi peninsula, that entire region. They had Egypt. They had what is now Israel. I found this on the web. They had Jordan. They had Iraq. They had the entire Middle East. And they sat down and started drawing borders. And as part of the process around this, in 1917, there was the Balfour Declaration. Lord Balfour made a declaration saying that they would take this part of this land that they had conquered from the Ottoman. They would take a piece of it, and they would give it to the Jews who were looking for a homeland at the time. Right? Zionism was a political movement started in Europe, basically with the goal of establishing a homeland for Jews because the idea was the Jews were persecuted, anti-Semitism was rampant, and the founder of the Zionist movement declared the Jews would be eradicated, eliminated if they stayed in Europe, which turned out to be unbelievably prophetic, because that's indeed what was attempted in the 1930s and 1940s by the Nazis. AK says Israel is a terrorist state. You have no idea what a terrorist state is. Israel is the anti-terrorist state. Israel is the island and bastion of civilization in an area of barbarism and terrorism. So Jews started emigrating, buying land, not taking land, and the British promised them this land. Originally, the promise was of what today is Jordan and Israel. They later cut off Jordan, and ultimately the British said, look, we can't just give this land just to the Jews. We're ultimately going to give part of the land to the Jews and part of the land to the Arabs and create two states in this tiny little piece of land. During the British occupation of this entire region, Jews continued to emigrate into Israel and build communities, build businesses, build civilization. As a consequence of all the economic activity that had been created primarily by these industrious Europeans who came into Israel and started building and started making stuff, a lot of Arabs from neighboring countries, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, emigrated into what is today Palestine. And they took jobs. There were jobs. There was economic activity. It was fantastic. And they became what today are considered, I don't know, Arab Israelis or Palestinians or whatever it happens to be. So this goes on. During World War II, horrifically, the British stopped allowing Jews to immigrate into what was then called Palestine. They blocked the ships. They prevented the Jews try to immigrate illegally into Palestine. Many of them, this is during World War II, while they were escaping the Nazis. They were often taken into camps in Cyprus and held behind barbed wires. At least they weren't slaughtered as their family members were being slaughtered in Europe at the time. And the British basically said, come in 1947, look, we can't resolve this problem. We don't know what to do. We promised this piece of land to the Jews, but the Arabs have a claim on it, and we don't want to have anything to do with this. So the United Nations was a brand new entity that was established. The United Nations, you guys should decide what should happen in this territory. And in 1947, in November of 1947, the United Nations Security Council met, and they voted by majority vote to establish two countries in what is today Israel. One defined as a Jewish state and one defined as a Palestinian state. And the amount of land that the Jewish state would have gotten was very small as compared to anything that the Israelis expected and wanted. But they celebrated it. It was international recognition of this new state. And the Arabs rejected it. And literally the next day, violence started. People here talking about Israelis killing children. Throughout the 20th century, early 20th century, Arabs slaughtered Jews, children, women. My grandfather was in Jericho in 1936 when there was an attack by the Arabs, and he was injured in that attack, and he left Israel as a consequence. Constantly, before the founding of the State of Israel, there was repeatedly violence against Jews who lived there, and again, who had bought property. There's no such thing as indigenous people. It's BS, and they didn't kick them out. They came in and bought property. This is the kind of ridiculous nationalism that exists today, that another people can't come into your place and buy property. No, they came in and bought property and established businesses. And again, most of the Palestinians, or a lot of the Palestinians, emigrated into Israel. They weren't even there originally. There is no indigenous people. So in 1947, there were two states established. The Arabs rejected it. And in May of 1948, the British left. Israel declared independence in the space that the UN had provided for it. And immediately was attacked by the armies of, I think it was 7 or 9 Arab countries. And not only did it have to defend itself against the Arabs who were living within these new borders, but it had to defend itself now against the organized military of Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Iraq and countries, Arab countries sent armed militaries from all over to participate in this war. And shockingly and amazingly and surprisingly, and certainly surprised the Truman administration, which did not expect this outcome, the Israelis won. And they won, and they indeed expanded the territory beyond what the UN had approved for them. But they'd won it, call it fair and square, in a war of aggression by the Arabs, in a war of self-defense. And that is what's called the pre-1967 State of Israel. The areas that they did not occupy, did not take control of, were the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. They took control of those in 1967 because another war of aggression by Arab states caused them, in an act of self-defense, to occupy those lands. I've told the Israelis to chill. Who cares about indigenous people? What matters are property rights. And if you come and you cultivate the land that is not used by anybody else, it's yours. And if you come and you buy the land from a legitimate title holder, it's yours. And if people on that land start attacking you and killing you, then you kill them first. Or, as in some cases, you frighten them away and they run away. But since they started it, their land is forfeit. It's gone. Forget it. So the idea that Israel owes anything to the so-called indigenous people, that it owes anything to the Palestinians, it's the other way around. I mean, if the Palestinians were self-interested, if they were individualist, then they would celebrate an Israeli economy, they would celebrate the jobs, they would celebrate the opportunities, they would love to become Israeli citizens. Not only that, I mean, I used to work with Arabs. I mean, you guys, particularly you guys who are so anti-Israel, I mean, you can sit here in the U.S. knowing nothing about the Middle East, reading bizarre, brainwashed, crazy books about the Middle East, basically leftist propaganda about the Middle East, and you can have opinions. But I lived it. And Israeli Arabs would tell me, that Israeli Arabs I'd work with, because I was a construction manager in the construction industry, and all of my contractors were Arabs. And they would tell me they'd bless Allah every day for being born in Israel. In Israel, they vote. In Israel, they have property rights. In Israel, they have free speech. They have members in the parliament. Once in a while, they'll even have a member in the government. They don't have any of that in any Arab country surrounding them. They don't have property rights in Syria. I mean, look at the civil war in Syria. Look at what's happening in Lebanon. They're wealthier, they're richer, they're better off in Israel than any other country in the world. Yeah, all the anti-Israelis have joined. That's why the number of views are up, because all the haters have joined us now on the chat. Word has gotten out that Iran is defending Israel, and they've all come to see it for themselves and bitch and complain and attack me on the chat. So it's no, there's a civilized country that respects, for the most part, property rights. And there are people who don't, who attack, who murder, who blow up buses, who hijack school buses and shoot the kids, who attack schools, attack weddings, blow up anything they can, kill as many civilians as possible. And Israel is supposed to Just be nice. Just provide them with electricity and food and welfare and money and pretend that they're some indigenous something or other. Who cares? They're murderers. What murders did the Israeli government commit? And the Israeli government is not, perfect. But on the scale, it is as close to perfect as possible as compared to their opponents, who have committed evil after evil after evil and have denied their own people any semblance of rights, have denied their own people property rights, freedom of speech, the vote, in any sense. Palestinians have no rights. All right. Sure, you have rights of conquest. When somebody else starts a war and you conquer their land and they refuse to have peace with you, what are you supposed to just hand over the land back and say, oh yeah, attack me anytime again, whenever you feel like it, come after me, come kill my people, as many as you want? You people are sick, altruistic, defeatists, suicidal nuts, if you think that's an appropriate way to handle things. I'm an egoist. I believe in individual rights. I believe in freedom. And that's why I'm pro-Israel. And if you're not pro-Israel, then you don't believe in individual rights, you don't believe in freedom. Yes, I know the Jews control the world. They always have. They always will. I wish they'd let me on the secret of how to do it. I mean, you guys are just bizarre. All right. Let's see. That was a joke, by the way. That was commenting on a comment in some conspiracy theories about. It's not my government. I don't live in Israel. I'm an American citizen. I consider myself an American, not an Israeli. But the Israeli government is not a government of saints. They're terrible. I'm a huge critic of the Israeli government. But to compare them to Palestinians is absurd and a massive injustice. Palestinian government is 1,000 times worse than the Israeli government. Let's see. Frank, if you want to ask a question, there is a super chat. You can ask it, and I will answer it. Let's see. What do I think of John Bolton's three-state solution? I'm not familiar with John Bolton's three-state solution, so I don't know what it is. If you want to educate me about what it is, I'll let you know what I think of it. Do you see an end to the conflict? What would that look like? Two states seems unviable due to the fervor on both sides. As I said, I don't see an end to the conflict anytime soon. It's decades away. Israel would have to completely change. It would completely have to get a moral backbone. It would have to be committed to its own self-defense. I see the status quo just continuing to erode both freedom inside Israel and freedom in the Palestinians. Things will get a lot worse before they get better. So I think things are gonna continue to be ugly and continue to be violent. And I don't see a two-state solution working. As I said, the real solution is a one-state solution, but I don't think either Israel or the Palestinians are ready for that solution, are willing to make that kind of deal. And again, no solution is possible as long as the Palestinians reject the idea of the existence of Israel. No solution is possible as long as the Palestinians hold on to the collectivist, religionist today, anti-freedom beliefs. They would have to change their culture. They celebrate suicide bombers. They build, the equivalent of statues and have celebrations, celebrating the death of a child if he straps on a suicide vest, and as long as he kills some Jews, then they're celebrated. Yeah, I figured that somebody who would hate Israel hates the United States even more, so that doesn't surprise me, AK. I don't know if you covered it. I came in late. Is it true Arafat was given everything he wanted but turned it down? Yeah, he was given not everything he wanted, but 90. Bill Clinton basically in Camp David gave him 94% or 95% of everything that he wanted. Literally 95%. I think the right of return into the state of Israel was denied him. That was the only thing. He got all the land, everything. In, I think it was 1999, he not only turned it down, but he then turned around and started the second Intifada, started massive suicide bombings, massive murder of Israeli civilians all over Israel, buses blowing up, restaurants blowing up. It was like 9/11 was happening every few months in Israel, but it was happening weekly. But in terms of the number of people killed per population, 9/11 was happening constantly through the early 2000s. And this goes to the next question. Hasn't America played a role in dissuading Israel from fully defending itself? Yes. But now it's managed to infect Israeli culture with its kind of rules of engagement, just war theory, and its altruistic ideology. So America's had a huge role. And if you go back and you look at the early 2000s, it was George Bush Jr. who kept tying the hands of Ariel Sharon, who actually wanted to defeat the Palestinians, wanted to kill Yasser Arafat. Actually, you can find a lecture I gave from that period at, I think, the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, in which I say that what Israel should do is capture Yasser Arafat and hang him from the tallest tree, and basically, this is what is done to terrorists in our country. And amazingly, that lecture was filmed by C-SPAN, and I think is still on the C-SPAN website. So you can look at the C-SPAN website and you will find that lecture, and you can get a lot more detail, particularly back down on what my view was during the Second Intifada of what Israel should be doing. But and the role of America, the horrific, immoral, unjust way in which the United States treated Israel. Let's see. In your past video discussion about Israel, you can talk about the man who said, "I am the victim of Israel." What did he mean by that? Was he wrong? I don't know. I don't know what that is referring to. I don't understand any of that. Sorry. San Francisco's that's okay. We're not doing that right now. How similar is the religious right in Israel as compared to the U.S.? More or less respectful of rights? Would you consider it a theocracy? Many critics offer. No, Israel's not a theocracy. The religious right, in that sense, is Israel in some respects is more secular than the United States. Certainly in its culture, it has a very, very secular culture, and it has more atheists per capita than the United States does. There are two different types of religious right in Israel. There is a nationalist religious right. And the nationalist religious right is, I'd say, more similar to the American nationalist religious right, in that they tend to be they pretend to be pro-markets. They're not really. They want industrial policy. They do all these things. But their main focus is on bringing religion more into Israeli culture and on the nationalist element. They want Israel to annex all of the West Bank. They would like to establish a kind of Jewish theocracy over the entire region. They're very involved, politically active. They go and settle on the West Bank. They're very engaged, and they have influence politically. But Israel is far from a theocracy. Indeed, you can. The other type of religious right in Israel is, yes, so they would be more like a Ben Shapiro here, probably. But then there's the other religious right, which is the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox don't care that much about Israel. They don't care that much about the state of Israel. They care about their own communities. And their main goal is to suck from the government as much money as possible for their own communities. They don't want their people serving in the Israeli army. They want their educational establishments to get money from the government. They want huge amounts of welfare for their people. Their main goal is to suck at the tit of government, for the government to protect them and to grant them all kinds of favors and rights. They also want to impose certain theocratic things, but they don't overstep their bounds because they know that the country would rebel against them. So they don't want buses to run on Saturday, and they want theaters to be closed Friday night and things like that. But that is resisted by most of the Israeli population. They're not involved much in foreign policy. Now, Bibi Netanyahu, has run his governments basically by sucking up to both religious right elements. So the ultra-Orthodox, he basically hands them all the goodies, checks from the government, subsidizes their lifestyle, subsidizes their education, subsidizes everything else. And for the nationalist right, he pretends to be really tough on foreign policy, and he pretends that he's going to annex and establish a greater Israel, and he plays that card to get their vote. But he plays those two elements in order to establish his coalition governments, right? And that's one of the many reasons why I despise him. I despise Netanyahu. All right. All right, let's see. Michael, the right cares more about order versus chaos than freedom. I spoke with a conservative who said he didn't want to get rid of welfare because so many people are already dependent, and doing away with these programs wouldn't bring about social instability. It would bring about social instability. I think that's right. They worry about chaos, but they worry about chaos even in one's personal life. So, for example, to them, homosexuality is chaos. They want families. They want order. They want tradition. They want it the way it used to be. Many cultures, immigration is chaos. All these new people coming in. What are we going to do with them? How, what will they do? And they're different than us. They look different. They behave different. They take different jobs. So yes, the right wants things as they used to be. They want them static. They want, as Ayn Rand called it, the right of stagnation. They don't want change. They're opposed to change. They reject change. And I think that's true of the American right. And if you listen to Sohab Amari, who is very influential on the right these days, he just came out with a whole article saying, we need to reestablish laws where you cannot open a business on Sunday. What do they call it? Blue light, something like that laws? Where you get fined if you open your business on Sunday. Because we need to reestablish the Sabbath. We need to get away from this, crazy capitalism. And we need to reestablish a Sabbath, a family-centered Sabbath. That's the American right today. Can a free nation expand into other territories? Can the capitalist government protect land owned by its citizens no matter where it's located? What if a free people want to own property where the existing government doesn't allow? So can a free nation expand into other territories? Yes, under two circumstances. One, if it's attacked, and expanding into the other territory is necessary for its own self-defense. Now, to the extent that the land in this new territory is privately owned by existing residents, and those residents have not taken up arms against them, then they should respect the private property rights of the residents who they have now occupied. But yes, they can expand as an act of self-defense. Second, they could expand if there was no war involved. They could expand into a territory of an authoritarian regime, of a regime that had no respect for the individual rights of its own people. They could expand into a place that was ungoverned, where there was nothing there. And again, the commitment it would have to have is to establish and protect individual rights in this new region, including the people that it occupied. Right. What if people want to own property where the existing government doesn't allow? Then they can't. What does that mean? You can't just go somewhere. You can't expect your government to cross borders in order to allow you to do something that another country doesn't allow you to do. Now, again, with strategic property, like in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with oil, when you discover the oil and then it's stolen from you, yeah, I think your government should protect you, your property rights. It should protect you under all circumstances. It would have to be very, you'd have to establish the context in which it was. Let's say you owned a big ranch that was bordering the United States. And the government on the other side, which was a weak government, an authoritarian government, took it away from you. Then you could make an argument that under certain circumstances, the United States government should take that land, reestablish your property rights on it. But if it's somewhere across the ocean, of course not. So it would have to be very much a contextual issue. But the role of the government is to protect the rights of individual Americans. AKA repeating something doesn't make it true, and in your case, it's just repeating something just shows the emptiness of your position. Let's see. What was the different about Gaza compared to the West Bank that caused Israel to pull out of Gaza? Was there a cultural difference? No, it was the complexity of dealing with Gaza and its relative strategic inimportance. First, you have to remember that the Egyptians didn't want Gaza. Gaza was offered to the Egyptians as part of the peace deal with Egypt. And Egypt said, no, you can keep it. We don't want Gaza. Gaza is a tiny piece of land with very, very, very heavily, it's an urban center with a lot of population crammed into a very small place. It requires urban warfare to occupy. It's very difficult to defend. It's very easy to segregate out, to say, this is yours, here it is. You get this rectangle, which is what it is. Easy borders, relatively easy borders, and you've got a massive population in a very urban setting. So it was very, very costly in lives, in injury, in lives of Israeli soldiers, to fight in there, particularly if you insisted on rules of engagement, like practiced like in the United States. So, and there was also argument made, particularly on the right, and remember this was a right-wing government that left Gaza, that gave it to the Palestinians. There was an argument to be made that if you left, then anytime Gaza attacked you, you now had an excuse to crush them. I heard this all the time. People would tell me all the time, when I objected to Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, people would tell me, no, now, when they attack us, now we have a real excuse to defeat them thoroughly and to crush them. The problem now, we can't do that because we're the occupying army. So they stopped occupying, they left. And Hamas and the Palestinians and the Gaza Strip continue to attack Israel. And did Israel crush them? No. Nothing changed. Israel's fought several wars in Gaza. You know, they're very costly in lives, and nothing has changed. So the retreat from Gaza, the handing over the Gaza to the Palestinians has turned into an unmitigated disaster for Israel. Completely disaster. Let's see, we have 155 people watching. We've only got 88 likes. There should be a lot more likes. I know some of you don't like the show. Give it a thumbs down if you want. I don't care. But have an opinion. Interact. Go to the like button. Press the like button. It helps with the algorithms. It gets the show more visibility. We'll get more subscribers that way. We get more support more broadly. It really helps. So I really, really would appreciate it if you guys who are watching right now, before you leave, like the show. Of course, if you're not a subscriber to the show, subscribe to the show. You'll also get, if you click that bell over there, you'll get an announcement for when the show goes live, and you'll be able to follow the show more closely that way. And of course, if you like what you hear on the show, if you find it interesting, and you'd like to offer value for value, remember, everything you get on YouTube, you're getting for free. Particularly if you watch live, you don't even watch commercials. And none of my live shows have commercials. Then become a supporter of the show. You can do so on Super Chat. We try to get to $400 on every Super Chat, every live show. I think we're 270. So we've got 130 to go. So if anybody would like us to help us get to 130, that would be great. Any question over $20 gets priority. I'll answer it quickly, but I do get to all the questions ultimately. I do answer them all. So you can jump in and participate and support the show rather than just harassing me on the chat. You can actually support what we're doing here and support the conversation. Actually ask an obnoxious question. That's okay too. You can ask any kind of question on the chat. So thank you, Joe. So we now have less than $130 to go. So please use the Super Chat feature to support the show. You can also support the show at YaronBrookShow.com/support, Patreon, or Subscribestar. Yaron, I was referring to the video, Yaron Brook to a Palestinian, the truth is one-sided, but I don't remember exactly what you were referring to, so that doesn't help me. You have to give me more context. I do a million videos, and I don't remember what I said exactly on that video. Let's see. In the comments of the chat, I described the proposal of John Bolton's three-state solution. Those comments, way up there. I can't get to them. If you want to restate them in the chat right now, I'll look for them and answer the question. But it's way up there on the chat, and I can't get to them. DeSoto did not pass the second ride. I know. It was pretty sad that he didn't. I just hope the Marxist doesn't win. I hope the Marxist doesn't win. As a general rule, how do you decide who to read and what to believe when starting to learn about history? That's a really hard question. And I don't have an obvious answer to that. You have to read a lot in different perspectives. But you have to have, I think it's hard to do without having a certain view about the world. So, for example, a lot of histories today are written by Marxists. And you can tell it's Marxist because of the way they write about labor and about capitalism and about the 19th century and about stuff. And I just generally don't trust Marxists, right? Because they have a very distorted view of history and of the world. And then you can read history and you suddenly find that the person is emphasizing the importance of religion, and religion is everything, or nationalism. So you got to be on the lookout for the things that you know are wrong, philosophically. If they're explicitly anti-individual rights, how good of a history are they going to have? So you've got to read widely. You've got to try to find, reliable sources, in a sense of people you know who might have knowledge about history, who can make recommendations. And you've got to be skeptical of histories written in the last 20 years, particularly if you can sense a certain political leftist or nationalist religious agenda in them, because so much of history is written that way. But anybody espousing postmodernism, you can't read a history by them, because they don't believe in truth. They don't believe in truth. So you've got to read widely and find authors that you think have a view of, for example, the values of Western civilization, the values of individualism, the values of capitalism, or the values of freedom. That at least they're coming to the writing of history from the perspective of they like human beings and they like freedom. Right? Because otherwise, if they don't, then that's going to taint their history. But I'm sympathetic with the fact that it's very, very hard, particularly when it comes to something like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's very hard because most of the histories are not very good. All right, we're at $295, only 105 left. I know one or two of you could do this just like that, just in one super chat, and we're done, and I don't have to bug you anymore. All right, let's see, is there another, just in the context of this question on history, you once mentioned The Cave in the Light. I got it and loved it. What did you like about it? Well, I'm listening to it again now, and I think The Cave in the Light is a really good book. I think it's well written. I like the way it's written. It's written like a story. I like the way it weaves philosophy into the whole story, and it shows the impact of ideas. Now, I'm sure that philosophers will object to it because it probably gets on the philosophy wrong, and maybe it's superficial in certain levels. And I'm sure the historians will complain because I'm sure it, kind of simplifies and it. But if you're going to do a whole history since the Greeks of Western civilization, and you're going to integrate philosophy with history, it's not going to satisfy everybody. But I think it's excellent. I'm reading it again right now. So I'm actually listening to it on tape. So I'm on Rome right now. I'm just starting on the chapter on Christianity, which I remember I thought was very good. So I highly recommend for history The Cave in the Light, and the role of ideas in history and the way ideas shape history. And basically the thesis there, which is a thesis that Ayn Rand had and Leonard Peikoff has, which is that history of Western civilization is basically a battle between Aristotle and Plato. And this book concretizes it nicely over time. Yeah, I mean, one of the things you have to look for in the history books is what are they saying about class conflict, about class struggle. That are the Marxists, and beware, right? Now again, but you also have to be careful of the nationalists, the racists, the religionists who also have an agenda in their history books. So you have to be equally alert to those problems. For example, in Israel, it's very hard to get a real history because the history of Israel was written to a large extent by socialists. So, for example, the role of industry in the history of Israel is you can't find in almost any book. It's very hard to find, or the evil of the kibbutzim, these socialist communes. Most books rave about them. If you actually look into it, you look at the proper history, they're bad. It's very difficult to become an expert in a particular historical field. Because you have to read, if you're going to be an expert, you have to read the original sources. And you, as a non-expert, have to figure out who's a good source and who's not. I'm not, there's no way to make this easy. It's difficult. It's difficult. All right, two good Leon Uris novels. I agree on this. Leon Uris wrote novels that happen, two of them, The Exodus and The Hajj, are both centered around the beginning of the State of Israel. So they're centered around 1948 or leading up to 1948. And they're both excellent books. And you will learn a lot about what happened historically. So they're novels, obviously, but interwound with real history. And I think his history is as good as anybody in terms of actually showing what actually happened in Israel at the time. So I generally recommend Leon Uris' books. Those two are excellent. Exodus and the Hajj are brilliant. All right, we are about $90 short, so $90. You should be able to do $90. Do you view the Republican support for Israel as principled? Sorry, I principled and Republican. I just can't think of them in the same sentence. No, I don't think it's principled. We can go over the different forms, and I'm not sure there's even support, right? I'm not sure there's even actual support of Israel. So Republicans support Israel. Well, put it this way. Most Republican presidents have sold Israel down the river. Nixon forced Israel to sign a ceasefire agreement in 1973 when Israel was about to crush the Egyptian forces and completely, I think, changed the Middle East, and he wouldn't let them do that. Partially, supposedly, because the Soviets threatened to send troops in, but not just that, but because he wanted handcuffed. Ronald Reagan allowed Yasser Arafat to escape Beirut when Israel was going to kill him and destroy the Palestinian military, and he allowed him to escape to Tunisia. W. Bush, another Republican, prevented Israel from killing Yasser Arafat in the early 2000s during the Second Intifada, and basically tied Arik Sharon's hands, ultimately leading to leaving the Gaza Strip. Sharon believed he couldn't really defend, he couldn't really deal with the Gaza Strip, particularly with the constraints the Americans had placed on him. Trump was about as good as it gets. Moving the embassy was a good move. His peace deal was not a good peace deal for Israel, but it was better than what others have proposed, but it wasn't particularly good. But he didn't do it for principled reasons. Again, there's no principles in Trump in the same sentence, unless you're denying one or the other. He did it because he was trying to appease the evangelicals. The evangelicals support Israel. And you could argue that their support for Israel is principled in the sense that a wrong principle. They want to support Israel because they believe Israel is important for the second coming. It's associated with Armageddon and the second coming of Jesus. And there has to be a state of Israel for the second coming to happen. That's their reading of the Old Testament or the New Testament. And they are supportive of Israel because of some religious fervor. Now, there are other evangelicals who hate Israel, who are very much in support of the Palestinians because they view Israel as strong and altruistic, and therefore they would rather support the Palestinians. So there are very few Republicans who support Israel on principle. I mean, John Bolton is one. He's one of the few, right? I've always liked John Bolton, and I found it amazing that Bolton was loved until Trump fired him, and then suddenly was hated, as if Trump firing him changed the character of what Bolton stood for. It's stunning how Republicans became sheep, and still are sheep, during the Trump administration. What rights do innocent people living under a terrorist or rights-violating government have? Do they share responsibility in any way? Well, it depends, right? So you're saying they're innocent. So innocent suggests that they don't share responsibility. But how do you define innocent, right? Certainly the children are innocent. They're not responsible for the regime, but are their parents? Are their parents trying to undermine the regime? Are the parents working for the regime? Are the parents supporting the regime, even by their silence? So Ayn Rand claimed that, for example, in the Soviet Union, there were very few people who were innocent. So very few people are truly innocent in a terrorist rights-violating government. Because most of them are passive and acquiescing and supporting even and working for often. And in that sense, they share responsibility. It is only the ones who stand up against, who fight, who minimize their productive ability, who don't work for the regime, are the ones that are truly innocent in such a regime. Everybody else to one extent or another, shares the responsibility of what that regime actually does, including if it declares war. If you became the world emperor tomorrow, how would you solve the issue in the Middle East? Israel, Palestine, Iran, Iraq, etc. Well, I mean, if I became world emperor tomorrow, as von Mises said, I would resign. You can't solve problems through authoritarian means by being world emperor. But the way to resolve the issues in the Middle East is to crush your enemies. So Iran needs to be provided with the infrastructure that its philosophy deserves, which is, they need to be given every opportunity to reform, to get rid of the regime they have today, to adopt appropriate values, to stop their aggression around the world, or face real devastation. And the same with the Palestinians. They need to be given an opportunity to lay down arms, to recognize the state of Israel, to live in peace with Israel for X number of years, at which point they would become part of Israel. But short of that, they need to be reoccupied, the territories that now are under autonomy, and they need to be re-educated, and they need to be unequivocally told that they will never win, they will never defeat Israel, and Israel will do anything and everything to defend itself. And then I would leave the rest to rot. Why do you have to go? Why do you have to do anything else? All right, if a factory releases, this is the first question that was asked. It's not on topic and it wasn't $20. That's why I left it for last. But if a factory releases a chemical into the atmosphere, and that chemical is discovered to cause cancer, should the government ban that chemical? It depends. What does causing cancer mean? Any quantity of that chemical causes cancer. A certain concentration of that chemical causes cancer. It causes cancer for people living within 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles, 100 miles. So there would have to be a real evaluation. Thank you, John. You're moving to Austin. Cool. Excellent. Moving back to Austin after 51 years. That's amazing. Everybody lives now in Austin. Everybody lives in Austin. That is fantastic. So where were we? So you would have to basically figure out the context. But if it's clear that factory X's behavior is causing people to get cancer, then that behavior has to stop. They're doing harm to the people. So if you can objectively prove this harm, then it should be stopped. And then proper scientific study should be done, should be engaged in, to figure out in what quantities, under what circumstances, can it be filtered, can it be stopped, to ban the substance, and in what context, in what situations it should be banned. And yes, in those circumstances, the government should ban it, in the situation where it's clearly and unequivocally causing harm to people. Right? But that should be a whole process, and it should be sensitive to circumstances, to context, to quantity, and all of those things. Right? Yeah, toxicity is dose dependent. So if they cut the amount of the chemical use by 100, if it was just 1% in the air, and that didn't cause cancer, is that okay for them to do? It should be, but in the laws we have today, they overprotect. They go over because they're not interested in science. The environmentalists and the EPA are not interested in science. The San Francisco DA's office announced shoplifting amounts under $200 will not be prosecuted. Yeah, I mean, San Francisco is, what's it called? I'd say it's going to the dogs, but it's not. It's going to the homeless. It's going to the criminals. It's going to hell. And people are going to leave, and store owners are going to shut their stores, and it's an absolute unmitigated disaster, the place. And you should leave San Francisco if you live there. You should stop supporting these people. This is what shruggy means. Like John, go to Austin. Go to places where they still have some, at least a little bit, of respect for private property. Because in San Francisco, they have none. So I encourage people to leave San Francisco, as beautiful and as amazing of a city it is. And it's one of the great, great, great cities in the world. Maybe one of the top 3 most beautiful cities in the world. And the leftists there have destroyed it, completely and utterly destroyed it. One of the things that I find really interesting, and you know, we can speculate about the reasons for this, and this is not related to San Francisco. By the way, the systemic racism, I will do next show, because I'm already an hour and a half into this, and so I'll delay the systemic racism. I was going to talk about an essay by John McWhorter about systemic racism, which he's great. John McWhorter is truly fantastic, the linguist. So I'll talk about that next show, which will be probably on Wednesday at 8 p.m. East Coast time. But one of the interesting things, you can see this on the chat here, is there are certain people, often libertarians, sometimes kind of white kind of nationalist types, I don't know, that just viscerally hate Israel. I mean, it's not, yeah, I think they're wrong, but hate it, despise it. Recirculate lie upon lie and distortion upon distortion, and nothing Palestinians do bothers them. Israel is somehow evil through and through. And it's just fascinating. Now, for many of them, it's just old-style anti-Semitism. It's just they hate Jews. And Israel is a successful country of Jews. And they just despise the fact that Jews are being successful and have their own state and have done well and have the second highest rate of tech startups, second only to Silicon Valley, and just doing amazing. And it's in the visceral hatred that comes out when they talk about Israel. You know, they can be reasonable about so many other topics. But when it comes to Israel, it's just visceral. And they're obsessed by it. They still worry about the ship that Israel bombed in 1967 in the Mediterranean. And that it's an obsession, right? And again, it's not even like the left. It's not even like the left. Because they hate Israel much more than even the left does. And they buy into all of the left propaganda on Israel. They hate the left on everything, except on one issue, Israel. And AK says, I don't hate Jews. So he didn't, I hate Zionists and its regime. Why? And why so much? You don't live there. I don't know. You come from there? Your parents Palestinians? I mean, what is this personal, visceral issue, right? That causes you to hate Israel so much if it's not anti-Semitism. It's a hatred of success. Now, some of them are anarchists who hate any state that actually protects its individual rights of its citizens to some extent and actually flourishes and succeeds and is wealthy and is good. Palestinians have killed many more women and children. I don't hear you rallying against Palestinians. I don't hear you talking about the school children that Palestinians have killed, kidnapped busloads and killed them. I don't hear you talking about, female genital mutilation in Saudi Arabia and the stoning of women for adultery. No, it's Israel. And that's suspicious. It's just bizarre. It's hate. A lot of it is envy. It's hatred of the good for being the good. That's what Ayn Rand called it. And they really are just hating of the good. If Israel was a rundown, second-rate, authoritarian country that also did what it does today, they wouldn't care. They wouldn't care. It's the fact that it's free. It's the fact that they're relatively good makes them viscerally hate it. It's why focus on it when there's evil all over the world? It's the one country that they despise more than any. And that to me is sick. And definitely a sign of, if not anti-Semitism, some of the horrible, I think envy is a good description of it. Horrible set of ideas. All right, guys. I will see you all on Wednesday when we'll talk about systemic racism and talk about John McWhorter. If you've never heard of John McWhorter, then you're in for a treat. He's quite something. That'll be Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Before you leave, don't forget to like the show. Press that like button. We've had a lot of views, and we should have more likes than we have right now. Don't forget to share the show if you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. If you get any value here, subscribe to it. Click that bell so we hear when, so you know when I go on live. And of course, if you find value in here, support the show. You can support it on YaronBrookShow.com/support. You can support it on Patreon and Subscribestar. And finally, if you'd like to sponsor a show, you can sponsor a show as an advertiser. If you've got a product you'd like to advertise, a service you'd like to advertise, a business you'd like to advertise, happy to if I like the service, the product, and so on, happy to advertise your product here on the show. You can contact me about sponsorship opportunities that way, YaronBrookShow.com, Yaron@YaronBrookShow.com. If you want to sponsor the show in terms of a topic, the education topic was sponsored. Somebody sponsored it for $1,000 and they got to choose the topic. You can choose the topic of a future show. If you like the Yaron Brook Rules for Life and you'd like to have more Yaron Brook Rules for Life, maybe you'd like to sponsor one of those shows, or maybe you'd like to sponsor more positive shows, or shows on technology, or shows, other types of shows, feel free. $1,000 to sponsor a show, $500 for a review of a movie, and thanks, everybody. We reached our goal from a super chip perspective. We went over $400, so we're at 435, I think, and that's great. So I really appreciate your support. I appreciate Alejandrina egging you on and encouraging you. So thank you. I appreciate all of you who came to express your anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli nonsense. You can skip it next time. You can skip it next time. You don't actually have to show up. Bye, everybody. Talk to you on Wednesday.